From Illinois, Mr. Jackson is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the minority leader.
Thank you so much. Thank you, my dear colleague. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the subject of this special order hour.
Without objection.
It is now my privilege to address you. In the play of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony proclaims, "What cause withholds you then to mourn for him?" And I rise tonight because this is our question today. By what measure and according to what standard might we allow this week to slip between our fingers and not remember what happened on a street in Minneapolis on May 25th? What in all creation would justify our forgetting? A collective unconsciousness. We are summoned into this chamber tonight because George Floyd should be alive today. He should be enjoying the matriculation of his daughter from one grade to the next. He should be living out his days under the protections afforded to every American citizen, such as the presumption of innocence, equal protection under the law, and all of the 8th Amendment rights against cruel and unusual punishment. But tragically, none of what ought to be is true in the case of Mr. George Floyd. George Floyd is not alive. George Floyd was not protected. And George Floyd was not a victim of just bigotry and neglect. He was killed by the very institution employed to ensure his safety. But this is what happens when people don't see you as being someone and something worthy of protection. This is what happens when you are viewed as a threat and blackness is seen as a problem and not as a gift to the world. Indeed, what happened to Mr. George Floyd over a $20 alleged bill. They said there was a $20 bill that was counterfeited that had the assistance of 5 officers dressed in uniform in broad daylight to suffocate him. No one ever knows of what will happen to the alleged $20 fraudulent bill. What happened to George Floyd is a predictable outcome when the country you live in would rather build prisons than reimagine schools, would rather blame poverty on the poor but never question the gluttony of the rich, and would rather ignore the persistent evil of racism as if the record of our inability to honor each other's humanity has not already resulted in tragedy and death. The beaches of American history are cluttered with the bleached bones of the innocent needlessly slaughtered on the battlefield of this nation's preoccupation with subjugation and hatred. I remind you that Mr. George Floyd died in the new millennium. This isn't something of a tragedy I'm talking about from a century ago. This was the new millennium. And George Floyd deserved to be alive today. What happened to Mr. George Floyd is the rhyme that makes history, makes whatever we fail to be honest about racism, militarism, and indeed a destructive system. But we have gathered here tonight to answer Mark Antony's question. There is no cause, and there are no foreseeable circumstances that would compel us to forget what happened to Mr. George Floyd. George Floyd was murdered by a police officer who refused to see the humanity of the helpless, who refused to see the humanity of a handcuffed man, who refused to see a man gasping for his last breath with a knee wedged on his back while suffocating him and impoverished. And I say to you, anyone born of a woman should have been able to identify with the pleading of George Floyd not to lose his life. Mr. Floyd asked for his mother as he gasped his last breath. One does not need a graduate degree in ethics or morality or philosophy to have been moved by the elegy of George Floyd. And not only does this event say something about the totalitarian impulses of policing in America, but it also says something about the kind of nation we have allowed ourselves to become. We have also allowed certain political influences to compel us to see each other as enemies and not merely as adversaries. We have allowed sentiment, resentment to determine how we respond to one another and not what is required of us if we are to survive. But this week also presents us with a golden opportunity that we cannot ignore. The painful anniversary of the murder of George Floyd presents us with a chance to not only recommit ourselves to the eradication of racism and police-sponsored violence in America, but it also reminds us that there is a piece of legislation pending in the Senate that needs to be passed right away. The George Floyd Policing Act deserves to be taken under consideration by every United States senator immediately. Because without reforming how black people are policed in this country renders the murder of George Floyd a tragedy, but nothing more. And I say to you today, why settle for a tragedy when we can make him and make a new beginning? We have it within our power to make sure that what happened on May 25th, 2020, just 4 years ago, never happens again. We have it within our reach to lift America from the fatigue of despair to the buoyancy of hope. Every member of the United States Senate has a moral obligation to reconsider and indeed pass George Floyd Policing Act and not hide behind the politics of our respective parties. Because the question before us is a simple one. Do you want our beloved and our great country to be a place that is safe and fit for your children to forge a future without fear and the prospect of indiscriminate hate and violence? If the answer is yes, then let us work towards getting together to ensure that we will never again be driven into this chamber to remember the death of innocents. If the answer is yes, then let us choose a more excellent way. And if the answer is yes, then let us not be weary in well-doing. For in due season we will reap what we have sown if we have not faint not. Mr. Speaker, it is so important that today we remember those of Central Park, the innocent young men that were tortured into a false confession. 35 years ago, they received no mercy. 35 years later, they received no recognition by a former president. Those young men had their lives turned upside down while they were accused of a hateful vengeance attack and rape indeed by a person who has been convicted of such. And yet, this man asked for these men to be taken to the death penalty. And these were teenagers that had been found innocent. Mr. Speaker, it is now my privilege to yield to the Honorable Rashida Tlaib from the great state of Michigan.
Thank you so much to my wonderful colleague from Illinois who continues to speak truth to power, especially around police violence. Mr. Speaker, George Floyd's life mattered. We all know and keep chanting Black Lives Matter. Well, we have to show it in action. Today I'm thinking of George Floyd's daughter, Gianna, who will grow up without him. I can still hear George Floyd crying out for his mama, yelling, "I can't breathe," more than 20 times while he was murdered by police, pleading for his life for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. His murder and the countless others in the hands of police sparked outrage, mobilization, and movements for change. I saw from my own eyes right here on this House floor watching Republicans and Democrats come together in passing the George Floyd Justice and Policing while it went to the Senate to die. His murder and the countless others in the hands of police require us all to understand the truth about what's going on in our neighborhoods and our communities. We demand that this body take immediate action to dismantle systemic racism in our country and systems designed to oppress Black and brown lives in every corner of our country. It's not enough, Mr. Speaker, to honor George Floyd's life with words. We must honor his life with action. 4 years later, George Floyd's Justice and Policing Act has still not been signed into law. Last year was the deadliest year of police violence on record. That should shock us all. Just this month, Mr. Speaker, Roger Fortson, A black senior airman was shot in Florida, at his home in Florida, 6 times by police and killed. This is his family. Just watching his mother kneel down in his open casket, that should be enough for us to act. How many more mothers have to experience the loss of their child? When will Congress finally act? We must ensure true accountability, justice, and reparations for the generations of harm policing in our nation has inflicted on our black neighbors. This is the justice George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Roger Frotson, and so many others who have lost their lives to police violence. That's the least they deserve. This is just justice for our communities, and they deserve to be fully seen, heard, and protected. I will continue, along with my good colleague from Illinois, to continue to push for the passage of George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. I know in Detroit, where I grew up, the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, for all those that continue to demand justice in our communities, know this: the President of the United States didn't wake up one day and say the Civil Rights Act was a good thing. People marched, they did sit-ins, they did boycotts, until they moved this institution in the White House. So we'll continue to march, we'll continue to demand that Black lives matter in our country. And again, with my good colleague, we'll continue to demand that George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passes this chamber, through the Senate, and to the President's desk. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back to my good colleague from Illinois.
Thank you. I thank the Honorable Congresswoman from the great state of Michigan, the Honorable Rashida Tlaib, for your outspokenness. Mr. Speaker, you have heard from my distinguished colleagues today about policing in our communities and about the loss of innocence, all issues of great importance to the Congressional Black Caucus, our constituents, Congress, and all Americans tonight. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.